The unseen struggle. Captain Malcolm Carter had been flying planes for over 12 years. He had worked hard, risen through the ranks, and had earned the respect of his colleagues, both on the ground and in the air. Today, he was flying a commercial flight from New York to Los Angeles. He dressed in his uniform with pride, the golden epaulets on his shoulders gleaming under the airport lights. As he walked through the terminal, the passengers gave him a polite nod, and he returned their smiles with a quiet sense of gratitude. This was his job, his passion, and he was proud of it. Malcolm had learned long ago that his appearance would sometimes draw stares and glances. At 6'1", with a muscular build and dark skin, he often stood out in a crowd, especially in a field that had not always been welcoming to people who looked like him. But he had never let that discourage him. He had always believed in his skills, his knowledge, and his abilities. Flying was something he loved with all his heart, and he had worked relentlessly to be the best pilot he could be. As he made his way toward the cockpit, feeling the usual excitement of getting ready to take flight, he noticed a woman standing in his path. It was the lead flight attendant. She was a tall, stern-looking woman, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, and her uniform immaculate. Her name tag read Ms. Evans. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "Can I help you?" Malcolm blinked in surprise. He had never been stopped like this before. "No, thank you," he said, his voice warm, trying to brush off what seemed to be an awkward misunderstanding. "I'm the captain for this flight. Just heading to the cockpit." Ms. Evans' eyes narrowed as she looked him over. She took in his uniform, his expression, then paused, clearly assessing him. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something that didn't sit right with Malcolm. "The captain?" she asked, her voice suddenly laced with doubt. "Are you sure?" Malcolm's smile faltered for a moment. His heart skipped a beat, but he remained calm. "Yes, ma'am. I'm the captain for this flight," he said, standing taller, his voice firm. "I need to prepare for takeoff." Ms. Evans didn't move. Instead, she crossed her arms and stared at him, a cold frown settling on her face. "This is the cockpit entrance," she said, her tone clipped, as if trying to guide him back in the direction of economy class. "The passengers are not allowed in here." The words felt like a slap in the face. Malcolm felt his face flush with heat, the weight of her words sinking in. Was she really questioning him? Was she implying that he, a highly trained pilot, didn't belong in the cockpit? "I assure you, ma'am, I'm the captain," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "I have the credentials, if you need to see them." She looked at him, seemingly unamused. "I don't think that will be necessary. But I just think you'd be more comfortable in economy," she added, her words dripping with a kind of judgment Malcolm had hoped he would never have to encounter again. Malcolm stood still, processing the sting of her words. He had heard of incidents like this, but to experience it firsthand was something entirely different. It was a moment that would challenge everything he had worked for. Would he let it slide? Or would he stand his ground? He chose the latter. He looked her in the eye, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your concern, but I am the captain. I have a job to do." The silence between them was thick, and Malcolm could feel the weight of the other passengers' gaze on him. He wasn't just fighting for his dignity. He was fighting for the respect he had earned through years of hard work. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ms. Evans sighed and stepped aside, though her look of distrust remained. Malcolm entered the cockpit, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger and frustration. He had faced adversity before, but this moment, this judgment based solely on his appearance, stung deeply. As the plane began boarding, Malcolm tried to push the encounter from his mind. He focused on his pre-flight checklist, double-checking every detail. But as he scanned the passengers settling into their seats, he couldn't help but wonder, how many of them were still questioning him? How many of them had fallen prey to the same narrow-minded assumptions that Ms. Evans had? Before he could finish his thoughts, the intercom buzzed. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ms. Evans' voice echoed through the cabin. "We'll be taking off shortly. Please fasten your seat belts and prepare for a smooth flight." The professionalism in her voice didn't match the earlier encounter, and Malcolm couldn't help but wonder if she had reflected on her actions. But deep down, he knew the battle wasn't over. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about fighting for respect and breaking the barriers that people like him had faced for far too long. The first test. As the plane began its ascent into the sky, Captain Malcolm Carter felt a familiar rush of adrenaline, the kind that always surged through him when he was in control of the flight. It wasn't just the mechanics of flying that thrilled him, though. It was the responsibility that came with it, the lives in his hands, the trust that passengers placed in him. There was no greater feeling, and he cherished every moment he spent in the cockpit. Yet, despite his focus, he couldn't shake the unsettling interaction with Ms. Evans. The plane leveled off, and the quiet hum of the engines filled the cockpit. Malcolm adjusted his seatbelt, feeling a subtle tension in his shoulders. He exhaled deeply, willing himself to relax, but his thoughts kept circling back to the confrontation. It wasn't the first time Malcolm had faced prejudice. He had grown up in a small town where his dreams of flying seemed impossible to others. He had fought tooth and nail to break through barriers, racial, economic, and social. His journey had been one of resilience, a journey defined by late nights studying aviation manuals, relentless training, and proving himself time and again to those who thought a black man didn't belong in the cockpit. But today, something about the encounter with Ms. Evans felt different. It wasn't just a casual misunderstanding. No, it was more insidious, a stark reminder that some people would never see beyond the color of his skin. For a moment, he had considered whether he should let it go, ignore it, and move on. But then he thought of the younger pilots who were just starting out, of the trailblazers who had paved the way before him, and of the passengers who had to sit in the cabin and witness this unfairness. No, he couldn't let it go, not this time. As the aircraft cut through the clouds, Malcolm reminded himself that he had a responsibility far greater than any personal slight. He wasn't just a pilot. He was an ambassador for all those who had fought for their place in this industry, for every individual who had been told they weren't good enough simply because of their race or background. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. The flight was smooth, the skies clear. The passengers were settling into their seats, some resting, others lost in their own worlds. But Malcolm couldn't shake the thought that Ms. Evans was perhaps observing him through her own lens, judging his every movement, doubting his every decision. The possibility weighed heavily on his mind. What if this wasn't over? What if, even after the flight was completed, she found a way to discredit him or make things difficult? As he flicked switches and monitored instruments, his mind wandered back to the first moments of their encounter. How had she doubted him so easily? Why hadn't she just trusted him when he said he was the captain? The disbelief in her voice was unmistakable. "Are you sure?" she had asked, as if to say, "There's no way you could be the pilot." He felt the sting of her words all over again. It wasn't just a question. It was an accusation. It was as if she was telling him, without saying it aloud, that his presence there was a mistake, that he didn't belong. Malcolm exhaled sharply and shook his head. He had spent so many years learning to tune out the negative voices, to silence the doubts that occasionally surfaced. But Ms. Evans had brought something to the surface that he hadn't expected. It was a sharp reminder that, no matter how much progress had been made, there would always be people who couldn't see past their prejudices. It was a sobering realization, one that Malcolm didn't want to face. Yet, he knew this was part of the journey, the part that would test him, challenge him, and force him to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Would he let this moment define him, or would he rise above it? He glanced at the radar screen in front of him, his fingers lightly grazing the controls as he recalibrated the settings for the altitude. The hum of the engines below him, the steady rhythm of the cockpit, seemed to ground him. Flying was his sanctuary, and he couldn't allow anything, especially not a single person's ignorance, to take that away from him. As the aircraft began its approach to Los Angeles, the hours passed without incident. The autopilot had taken over, and now, as the flight neared its final descent, Malcolm let himself breathe. There were still a few hours left before the plane would land, but the moment had a peaceful finality to it. Even though his mind was still on edge from the earlier encounter, he knew he was doing what he loved. The intercom buzzed, breaking his reverie. "Captain Carter," came the voice of Ms. Evans, crisp and professional. "This is Ms. Evans. We need to speak after the flight." Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, the matter had been forgotten. Maybe she had reflected on what had happened and realized her mistake. But the professionalism in her voice told him otherwise. He couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. She wanted to talk. And that meant she was still thinking about the incident, still not at peace with what had transpired. He tightened his grip on the control yoke, his thoughts swirling. Should he confront her right away? Should he ask her why she had doubted him? What if she tried to apologize and act like nothing had happened? Or worse, what if she doubled down on her assumptions and made excuses for her behavior? The uncertainty gnawed at him. For the rest of the flight, Malcolm focused on his tasks, but the looming conversation hung over him. He had to prepare himself mentally. He wasn't just going to sit there and let someone try to sweep this under the rug. It was too important. It wasn't just about him. It was about setting a precedent for the kind of behavior that would and wouldn't be tolerated. As the plane made its final descent into Los Angeles, he tried to keep his mind clear. He had done his job. The flight was on time, the passengers were safe, and that was all that mattered. But as they descended through the clouds and the lights of the city began to twinkle below, he couldn't ignore the conversation that awaited him. Malcolm's thoughts shifted again to the younger pilots, to those who were just beginning their careers. They would face challenges too, and they would have to confront their own Ms. Evans moments. The question was, what kind of example would he set for them? How would he navigate this test? How would he rise above the prejudice and judgment that would inevitably come their way? The airplane touched down smoothly on the runway, and the captain's voice came through the intercom, announcing their arrival in Los Angeles. The passengers began to gather their belongings, unaware of the tension that had brewed in the cockpit. But Malcolm knew that this moment, this challenge, was just the beginning. This was his test, and he was determined to pass it with dignity. The world was watching, and he wasn't going to let anyone define him by anything other than his skill, his commitment, and his character. He could already feel the weight of the conversation ahead, but he was ready. After all, this wasn't just about one flight. It was about changing the course of history, one flight at a time. The reckoning. The plane had just touched down at Los Angeles International Airport when Captain Malcolm Carter felt the first wave of exhaustion wash over him. Flying was never easy, but this time it was different. The tense encounter with Ms. Evans still echoed in his mind, the moment of doubt and disbelief lingering like an uncomfortable weight on his chest. The final approach had been flawless, but his thoughts had been elsewhere. As the plane taxied toward the gate, his hands instinctively guided the aircraft, his movements practiced and precise, but his mind was far from focused on the instruments in front of him. Malcolm had dealt with plenty of prejudice over the years, but this was something new. It wasn't overt racism or direct discrimination. No, it was the quiet, insidious kind, the kind that made you feel small without ever saying a word. He had earned his place as a captain, worked harder than most to get to this position, and yet Ms. Evans had looked at him and doubted him because of his skin. It wasn't just about one woman's misjudgment. It was the reflection of a larger, painful truth. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how many flights he flew, or how many lives he safely transported, he would always be seen through the lens of his appearance first. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, Malcolm's chest tightened. The announcement came over the intercom that they had reached their destination, and the passengers began to gather their belongings. The noise of 100 seatbelts unbuckling, overhead bins opening, and quiet conversations filled the cabin. But for Malcolm, the noise felt distant. His thoughts were still with Ms. Evans and the judgment she had passed, the doubt she had placed in him just because of the way he looked. He stood up slowly, taking off his captain's hat and giving the flight crew a brief nod as he made his way to the cockpit door. The passengers had already started to shuffle into the aisle, stretching their limbs and readying themselves to leave the plane. Yet, all Malcolm could think about was the conversation that would take place in a few minutes. Ms. Evans had asked to speak with him after the flight. The weight of that request hung heavily in the air. Malcolm wasn't sure what she expected from this conversation. Would she apologize? Would she make excuses for her actions? Or was she going to argue, try to justify her behavior, and insist that she'd done nothing wrong? Malcolm had no idea. But what he did know was that this moment wasn't just about one individual. This was about something far greater. It was about challenging a system, a mindset that had been ingrained for generations. It was about changing how people viewed him, and, by extension, how they viewed everyone who looked like him. The moment the cockpit door closed behind him, a deep sigh escaped his lips. He leaned against the seat, eyes closed, trying to clear his head. Flying had always been his escape. It was where he felt most at home, where the world felt balanced, where race, identity, and history didn't have the same weight. But that was just an illusion. The reality of being a black pilot in an industry where diversity was still fighting for its place was something Malcolm couldn't ignore. The flight attendants started to leave the cockpit, and one by one, the crew made their way to the gate. But as Malcolm looked up, he saw Ms. Evans waiting by the cockpit door. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. There was a tension in the air, something heavy and unresolved. "Captain Carter," she said, her voice quieter than before, as though the magnitude of the situation had finally dawned on her. "Can we talk for a moment?" Malcolm stood up, his heart pounding. He knew this conversation was coming, but the nerves still crept in. He had thought about it so many times, what he would say, how he would say it. But now that the moment was here, words seemed harder to find. "Of course," he said, his voice calm but firm. Ms. Evans stepped inside the cockpit, and the door clicked shut behind her. They were alone now, just the two of them, and the space between them felt like it was filled with unspoken words. Malcolm didn't sit down. Instead, he stood tall, letting the silence stretch between them, not wanting to break the moment too soon. I owe you an apology," Ms. Evans began, her voice trembling slightly. She seemed unsure of herself now, a far cry from the confident, dismissive attitude she had displayed earlier. Her hands, usually so composed in her uniform, were fidgeting nervously in front of her. "I should never have doubted you. I should never have treated you that way." Malcolm didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, and he knew this moment was bigger than just an apology. He had heard apologies before. They were easy to say. But the real question was, did she truly understand what had happened? Did she grasp the depth of what had taken place? "You were wrong," he said finally, his voice steady but unyielding. "What you did today, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a moment of judgment, a moment when you assumed that because of the way I look, I didn't belong here. And that's the problem. We live in a world where people still make assumptions about others based on appearances, based on preconceived notions that are harmful and damaging." Ms. Evans's face flushed, and she looked down at the floor, clearly uncomfortable. Malcolm didn't stop. He needed to say this, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed because of their skin color. "You made me feel like I had to prove myself," he continued. "Like I had to jump through extra hoops just to do my job. And I'm not the only one who's felt that way. Every person of color in this industry, every person who's had to fight for a seat at the table, feels that sting. It's not just the actions of one person, it's a culture. A culture that makes people like me feel like we're always on trial. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I've worked for years to be here. I've put in the hours, the sweat, the dedication. I sacrificed so much to get to this point. But no matter how many accomplishments I rack up, there are still moments like this, where someone looks at me and wonders if I belong. Ms. Evans stood there, silent, her eyes wide with understanding now. For the first time, she seemed to truly grasp what he was saying. It wasn't just about one small interaction. It was a larger issue, one that affected everything Malcolm had worked for. I never meant to make you feel that way, she said, her voice now sincere, her tone heavy with regret. I didn't think about it like that. I don't know. I was wrong. Malcolm nodded slowly. The real question isn't about you apologizing. It's about what happens next. It's about how we change the way we see each other. How we stop making assumptions about people based on how they look, how they speak, or where they come from. That's the work. It's not just a one-time thing. It's something we all need to be better at every day. Ms. Evans was quiet for a long moment, and Malcolm could see that she was processing everything he had said. Her posture softened, the defensive walls she had put up earlier seemed to crumble in the face of his words. I'm sorry for what I did, she said finally, her voice steady now. And I'll work to do better. I promise. I'll be more mindful, more aware. I'll take this lesson with me. Malcolm gave her a small, but meaningful nod. He wasn't looking for her to change overnight. He wasn't expecting a perfect transformation in the space of a single conversation. But this was a start. It was a beginning. And that was enough. I appreciate that, he said quietly. But remember, this is just one part of the larger picture. It's up to all of us to challenge these biases, to break down these walls. And I hope, when you go out into the world, you'll remember that. As the conversation wound down, Ms. Evans made her way to the door. She turned back one last time, her face a mixture of regret and determination. Thank you for speaking up. I'll do my best to be better. Malcolm watched her leave, feeling the weight of the conversation settle within him. It wasn't a victory, not in the traditional sense, but it was a step forward. For him, for her, and for everyone who had ever been judged based on the color of their skin. This wasn't just about an apology, it was about change, and even if it was just a small one, it was a start. As the plane's engines powered down, Malcolm felt a deep sense of peace. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. It wasn't just a job, it was a mission, and he would continue that mission, no matter what. The ripple effect. As the passengers disembarked, the hum of the airport terminal buzzed with the familiar chaos of travelers. The sound of rolling suitcases, hushed conversations, and the sharp calls of gate attendants filled the air, but for Captain Malcolm Carter, it felt like everything had slowed down. The adrenaline that usually accompanied the completion of a flight had dulled, replaced by a quieter, more reflective energy. He had been through a turbulent moment today, but there was something different in the way he felt now. It wasn't peace, but a deep, unshakable sense of responsibility. This was not a battle he was going to let go. It wasn't just about him. It was about breaking a cycle. Malcolm had always known that his career as a pilot would come with its challenges. But for as long as he had been flying, he had been met with subtle discrimination, an occasional remark, an uninvited glance, a lingering pause before someone believed in his capabilities. But today, something had changed. That quiet, insidious judgment, the kind that most people brushed off as just how things are, had been exposed. Not just by him, but through him. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last, to face this kind of ignorance. But now, for the first time, Malcolm realized he had a voice. Not just as a pilot, but as a witness to something far larger. As he walked through the terminal, the weight of the day's events was still pressing on his shoulders, but now, it felt like he was carrying it for a reason. What had happened wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper problem in society. He had been given a platform. What he did with it mattered. Back at the airline's base, Malcolm made his way to the crew lounge. The familiar faces of his colleagues greeted him, but today he felt a subtle shift in the energy. People who typically greeted him with a casual "Hey, Captain," or "Good flight," now seemed to look at him with something else, an unspoken understanding. He could sense their curiosity, a desire to know more about what had happened. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, on keeping his personal struggles separate from his work. But today, that separation seemed impossible. He walked over to the coffee machine, his fingers brushing the warm ceramic mug. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation with Ms. Evans, still feeling the weight of their exchange. As the coffee brewed, his thoughts wandered, and he remembered his earlier words to her. This is just the beginning. What did that mean? What did it really mean to begin to change a culture that had been built on centuries of prejudice? How did one man's confrontation in the cockpit begin to unravel something so entrenched? Before he could get lost in his thoughts, one of his fellow pilots, a seasoned veteran named Mark, walked up to him. Mark was a tall man, with graying hair at his temples and a calm, fatherly demeanor. He had seen it all, from mechanical failures to emergencies in the sky. But there was an understanding in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. "Malcolm, you got a minute?" Mark asked, his voice low and measured. "Sure," Malcolm replied, setting his coffee down. "What's up?" Mark hesitated for a moment, as though weighing his words carefully. "I heard about what happened on your flight. The thing with the flight attendant." Malcolm nodded. "Yeah, it wasn't exactly a smooth start to the day." Mark leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Listen, I've been in this business a long time, and I've seen things change slowly. But I'll be honest with you, it's not just about us up here in the cockpit. It's about everyone. Flight attendants, ground crew, passengers. Everyone. People like Ms. Evans. They don't just wake up one day with those ideas. It's a culture. It's how they've been taught to think, and how they've been conditioned." Malcolm swallowed hard. "I get that. I know it's not just one person's problem. It's about changing minds, changing attitudes. But I just keep wondering, how do we even start?" Mark looked at him, his gaze steady. "The way you're thinking right now, that's the start. You're talking about it. You're willing to stand up and say it. Most people would just shrug it off and keep moving. But you didn't. And that's what we need. People who are willing to speak out, who are willing to call things what they are. People don't change overnight, but if enough of us keep speaking up, keep shining light on it, eventually, things will start to change." Malcolm's chest tightened. The weight of Mark's words sunk in deeply. "So, what do I do now?" he asked. Mark gave a small shrug. "You keep doing what you're doing. You lead by example. You stay focused on your job, but don't be afraid to push the envelope. Use your position. You've got a platform here. And don't forget, you're not in this alone." Malcolm looked at Mark, a quiet gratitude swelling in his chest. Mark's words had given him clarity, but also the space to feel that this wasn't something he had to take on alone. He had his colleagues, and more importantly, he had his voice. "I'll do that," Malcolm said, feeling the weight on his shoulders shift. "Thanks." Mark gave a knowing smile. "Anytime, Malcolm. Anytime." As Malcolm left the lounge, he felt something stir inside him, a quiet resolve. He had spent years fighting for the seat at the table, but now, it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small or unworthy. It was about every individual who had been judged by their skin, their gender, their background. He wasn't just fighting for his job. He was fighting for the future of aviation, and beyond that, for the future of society. He returned home later that evening, his mind still buzzing with the events of the day. His wife, Tanya, greeted him at the door, her warm smile grounding him in the midst of everything. He had always been able to talk to her about anything, but tonight he felt the weight of the conversation he needed to have. Over dinner, he recounted everything: the encounter with Ms. Evans, his conversation with Mark, and the realization that this wasn't just a one-off moment. It was the beginning of something bigger. Tanya listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "I'm proud of you, Malcolm," she said, her voice steady and full of conviction. "But this isn't just about what happened on one flight. It's about something that affects a lot of people, and you've always known that. You've been through this before, and now you've got the chance to make a real difference." Malcolm nodded slowly. He had spent years navigating the small injustices, the quiet discrimination, and the constant need to prove himself. But now, the fight had a clearer purpose. It wasn't just about winning. It was about breaking barriers so others wouldn't have to face the same struggles he had. It was about building a world where his children wouldn't have to wonder if they were good enough. "Yeah," he said quietly, "this is just the beginning." The next day, he reached out to some of his colleagues, other pilots, flight attendants, even ground staff, and began to talk. He wasn't pushing an agenda. He wasn't rallying a protest. Instead, he was opening a dialogue. He wanted people to hear his story, to understand that the things they might brush off could have a deeper impact. Slowly, the conversations began to ripple out, like stones thrown into a pond, spreading further than he had ever imagined. Each conversation, each small step, was a piece of something bigger. Malcolm realized that this wasn't just about changing people's attitudes in the cockpit or among flight crews. This was about starting a movement, one conversation at a time. And at the very least, he would make sure his voice was part of that change. Days turned into weeks, and the ripple effect continued to spread. He didn't see the immediate change he had hoped for, but something had shifted. People began to notice. People began to listen. Slowly, but surely, a larger conversation was taking place, both within the walls of the airline and beyond. And as for Malcolm, he knew this was the right path. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but he was ready. This fight wasn't just about one flight. It was about changing the future for every pilot, every employee, and every person who ever had to prove they belonged. This was his mission, and he wasn't turning back. The turning point. Malcolm stood at the front of the crew briefing room, his uniform pressed and impeccable, a silent weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The room was filled with the usual assortment of pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew, people who made the wheels of the airline turn, their faces familiar and their voices friendly. Yet today, everything felt different. The weight of the previous weeks had begun to settle in, the ripple effect he had started now spreading further than he ever expected. A few days had passed since his conversation with Ms. Evans. While he hadn't heard much from her directly, the changes in her behavior were evident. She was more thoughtful now, more intentional in her interactions, and that subtle shift had caught the attention of others. Malcolm had been making an effort to reach out to his colleagues in a more personal way, initiating conversations about race, prejudice, and the challenges people of color faced in the aviation industry. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't comfortable, but Malcolm had come to realize that this discomfort was necessary. It was the first step in breaking down the invisible walls that had long segregated them from each other's experiences. As the crew members filed into the room, their eyes occasionally met Malcolm's. There was a subtle recognition in their gaze, a sense that they were all part of something important, even if they couldn't yet fully articulate it. And as he stood there, waiting for the briefing to begin, a quiet sense of purpose began to fill him. The path he had chosen wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be quick. But it was the right path, and he wasn't walking it alone. "Good morning, everyone," Malcolm said, his voice carrying across the room with confidence. He hadn't always felt this sure of himself, but the last few weeks had transformed something inside him. Maybe it was the weight of the fight, or maybe it was the realization that he couldn't stay silent anymore. Either way, he knew what he had to do. The crew members turned their attention to him, some with curiosity, others with an air of expectancy. Malcolm didn't waste any time. He wasn't here for a long speech. He wasn't going to deliver a perfect, rehearsed monologue. This wasn't about being a hero. This was about being real. "I know there's been a lot of buzz in the company recently," Malcolm started, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of the various staff members. "Some of you may have heard about what happened on my last flight. The situation with Ms. Evans. I'm sure many of you have questions, and I want to be honest with all of you about what went down." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. This wasn't just about Malcolm. It was about an issue that for too long had gone unaddressed. An issue that for many had been easier to ignore than confront. But Malcolm was ready to face it, head on. "I was questioned by Ms. Evans, the lead flight attendant, when I first boarded the plane," Malcolm continued. "She didn't believe I was the captain. She didn't trust that I belonged in the cockpit." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Now, I know some of you might think it's just a mistake, or that maybe I'm overreacting. But here's the truth. This kind of thing happens all the time. To me, to other pilots of color, and to countless other people in this industry." He could feel the eyes of the crew on him, some faces sympathetic, others unsure. But this was what he had expected. People rarely spoke about these things openly. Racism, prejudice, and discrimination were often brushed under the rug, hidden beneath layers of politeness and business as usual. But for Malcolm, business as usual no longer felt like an option. "Now, I know not everyone feels this way," he added, addressing the room. "But the fact is, it's happening. And it's time we start talking about it. It's time we start questioning the systems, the biases, and the assumptions that allow this to happen." The room remained silent for a moment, but slowly, people began to nod. Malcolm wasn't asking for everyone to agree with him or to suddenly have all the answers. But he was asking them to open their eyes, to start seeing the world through a different lens. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "I'm not asking for anyone to think I'm a better pilot because of the color of my skin. What I am asking for is for people to stop assuming that I don't belong. What I'm asking for is the opportunity to prove myself based on my abilities, not my appearance." The silence continued, but this time, there was a subtle shift. It wasn't the same uncomfortable tension as before. It was different. People were thinking, processing, reflecting. "I know this isn't easy," Malcolm said, his tone softening. "But I also know that nothing worth doing ever is." He felt the weight of the room settle, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were all on the same page. It wasn't just about a single flight or a single instance. It was about creating a culture where everyone, regardless of their background or appearance, had the same chance to succeed, the same opportunity to prove their worth. As the briefing came to an end, one of the flight attendants, a woman named Carla, raised her hand. She was new to the airline, having only joined in the last few months, and Malcolm had never really spoken to her before. But today her eyes were bright, her expression thoughtful. "I just want to say something," Carla said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've been with this airline for a while now, and I've seen things, heard things. I've always been taught to keep my head down, to follow orders and not cause trouble. But hearing you speak like this today, it's made me realize that maybe I've been part of the problem without even knowing it. Maybe I've been letting things slide that I shouldn't, and I want to do better." Malcolm's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a start, and sometimes that's all it takes. One voice, one person, willing to stand up and speak their truth. "Thank you, Carla," he said, his voice steady. "That's what this is all about. It's not about blaming anyone. It's about acknowledging that we all have a part to play in creating a better, more inclusive environment. And it starts with being honest." As the crew began to leave the room, Malcolm felt a quiet satisfaction settle in. He had no illusions that everything was fixed, that the work was done. He knew that these conversations had just begun. But he also knew that things had changed. He had changed. And more importantly, the people in that room had changed. They were thinking differently now, looking at the world through a new lens. In the weeks that followed, the conversations continued. Crew members began to open up to Malcolm, sharing their own stories, their own experiences of prejudice, of bias, of times when they had been overlooked or judged. These weren't always easy conversations. Some were uncomfortable. Some were painful. But every single one of them was necessary. Malcolm found himself invited to more and more discussions, not just within the company, but in broader forums as well. He had started to become a voice for change, a symbol of resilience and strength, not just for pilots of color, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. He wasn't perfect. He didn't have all the answers, but he was willing to keep showing up. He was willing to keep speaking the truth, no matter how difficult it was. And as he stood at the front of the crew briefing room that day, looking out at the faces of his colleagues, some new, some familiar, he knew that this was only the beginning. The work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Malcolm Carter felt that change was possible. One conversation, one flight, one moment at a time. And he was ready for it.